Hi, and welcome back to Continual. Tonight we are strapping on the anti-gravity boots and getting ready to launch into both the depths of space and the depths of the ocean. We're here to talk about old school time travel, old school monsters, and old school sci-fi. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and let's see who all has come in to talk about the classics. So, Wendy, you are up first.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm Wendy Van Camp. I am a author. I'm a poet, a speculative poet. I illustrate my books, and I'm an editor of poetry anthologies. And also, I am the poet laureate for the city of Anaheim. What appealed to me about this panel is that I have been writing book reviews on classic science fiction and fantasy novels for years. They've been publishing in journals all over the place. And it's a subject that I really enjoy talking about. So it should be a lot of fun tonight.
Doc, how about you?
Hi, I am Doc Coleman. I write steampunk comedy adventure. And I grew up reading some of the classic sci-fi authors. A lot of my early reading was Heinlein and Asimov, and a lot of the golden age names. So I've always been a big fan of them.
Elektra?
I'm Elektra Hammond. I'm a writer and an editor. I specialize in alternate history, but I'll write anything you pay me to write. And I came into science fiction from my dad, and he introduced me to sci-fi with some of his favorite writers. So I started with the true classics from the 50s and the 40s. There you have it.
Lee?
Hi, I'm Lee Martindale. I'm a short story slinger and an anthology editor. Space opera, science fiction, fantasy, Arthurian, Bardic. Basically, I read the guidelines and write stories. I came late to the party. I grew up in a time and a place, Kentucky in the 50s and 60s, where proper young ladies, and they did have hopes that I would be turned into one of those. Sorry about that. Didn't read such things. So I didn't discover science fiction until I hit college. And when a friend of mine there handed me my first science fiction, which was Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. Thankfully, he followed it up with Glory Road and The Moon is Our Mistress, which continues to be an annual read, or when I need a good cry. Yes, I cry when Mike doesn't answer. But I branched out from there, got my start in writing from having discovered Marion Zimmer Bradley's Darkover series, and started reading her, then reading the magazine, made my first professional sale to her. So I've got a warm spot for that one. But I did go back and catch up on the ones I'm supposed to read, Asimov and Clark and that sort of thing. And that's basically where my taste grew up. And I started reading what I most enjoyed.
Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy, several different kinds of romance, and with Jeannie Adams, I write the Outcast Station science fiction space opera series. I got into science fiction through a combination of the Legion of Superheroes comic book, because they were always zipping around in outer space, and young adult science fiction that at the time, people didn't really realize that the science was what we might politely call questionable, like a series called Venus Boy, about a young boy who lived on an Earth colony on Venus and had a pet/companion who was like a koala bear with jeweled claws, and smugglers liked to sell the claws. Now, today, I don't think anybody would set a story on Venus, but I still have a certain fondness for that book. And there was a series about a boy from Mars named Zip Zip, who crash landed on Earth and befriended some Earth children. Again, of dubious scientific value, but a lot of fun to read. And Scholastic Book Fairs got me into Dig Allen Space Explorer, which was on the Lost City of Uranus. They're on the cover in their spacesuits with one of those upright rocket ships in the background, and nobody's wearing gloves. It's like, yeah, okay, all right then. But I sort of moved into that, from that into other things, including some of the names that have already been mentioned here. And I'm really looking forward to this panel.
Looking back, talking about the famed Scholastic Book Fairs and all that kind of good stuff, right? One of the first really quote unquote sci-fi sort of books I remember reading, and I don't remember which one I read first, but I remember getting them at the same time. I got a copy of both Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, because I had seen the Disney movie as a kid, and I got a copy of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, right? Probably still both younger than I should have been reading them, but it was one of those things I remember. It was, they had played the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea on Sunday night on Disney, and so I'd seen it. I was like, okay, great, let me go read that. And I mean, I was probably 7 or 8 going through and trying to read, and the whole submarines and all the fun stuff that you go through. So, Wendy, I'm going to start with you on this. What is the first really sort of impression? What's the first book or the first author you really remember reading in the genre, and kind of what's that memory leave for you?
Well, that would have to be A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. I was kind of a preteen, maybe 13, 14 years old. I was just going through the library, and the cover back in the 60s featured this really big Thark, a big giant green guy with 4 arms, and with, of course, John Carter below and all that, and Deja Thoris. And I just on a whim, I picked it up, and I was catapulted into this space opera, featuring the Dead Sea of Mars, and John Carter, who was very gallant, and Deja Thoris, who was this woman with a lot of agency, which surprised me, and honestly still surprises me to this day. She was very much an outliner of the time. And I just kind of fell in love with that book, and I read the sequels. And that kind of got me started. I became a huge Heinlein fan with his juveniles. His later books were a little harder for me, but I loved the juveniles. Have Spacesuit Will Travel. I loved, oh gosh, there's just so many of them, Farmer in the Sky. There's just so many. And of course, we got The Moon is the Harsh Mistress and all these others. And of course, Heinlein is classic. I do caution young readers of today that it was written back in the 40s and 50s, and it is a reflection of the culture of the time. But the science and the stories are still phenomenal. And as long as you put that aside, you will enjoy the read. So, but I really like Edgar Rice Burroughs too. He has many series. I've actually been to Tarzana, which is where his estate is, and I've met his grandchildren, and they're lovely people. And it's really a fun romp. I love the John Carter of Mars series, but also his Tarzan series is very good, and of course, well documented in films. I've often been surprised that there's been more Tarzan movies from ERB than the John Carter of Mars, and Disney finally took a crack at John Carter of Mars, which they only called it John Carter, and it starred. Oh my goodness, who is he? He was a hockey player.
We'll come into the film adaptations here in a little bit.
Oh, no worries. But I've often been surprised that the John Carter series has not been adapted to film as often as the Tarzan ones. In my mind, they're very equal in weight. But anyway, I don't want to take over the panel here, so somebody else could talk.
So, Doc, how about you? What's that first inspirational piece for you?
The irony is that when I was growing up, I had a set of hand-me-down books that were the Tom Swift Jr. series from the 50s and 60s. And so those were in my room. So I was, reading about Tom Swift and his flying lab, and his, Tom Swift and his diving sea copter, Tom Swift and his giant robot. So when I first learned how to read, these were the books that were in my room. So I devoured them and read them through multiple times. So I was kind of immersed in this sort of post World War II atomic age science milieu where we don't know what's not possible, but we're pretty sure it involves electricity and atoms, and coming up with creative things, which actual scientists will later say, no, you can't do that, man. But that was kind of my deep dive into science fiction from the get-go. And from there, I discovered the Heinlein juveniles in school libraries, and then started into all of the Asimov stories because there were just so many of them. And I'm sure I remember some Frederick Pohl, but just start finding other people with other universes to branch out into. But it all really comes back to Tom Swift.
All right, Elektra, how about you?
My dad, when I was 12, wanted me to read science fiction, and he went to the North Orange Library in New Jersey and found Skylark 3 by Dr. E. Smith. Never mind, it was the middle of the series. He brought that home and gave it to me to read, and I was willing to read pretty much anything at that point. And I read it, and I adored it. It was science fiction, and it was spaceships, and they were flying, and it just blew me away. And that was the end of that. I was willing to read pretty much anything he handed me by then. The other things that he gave me around the same time that I still have and I treasure, because I had to give Skylark 3 back, and I eventually got all of the Skylark books and all of the Lensman books by Dr. E. Smith, were 2 anthologies. One was a Murray Leinster anthology called Twists in Time, which made me absolutely crazy about time paradoxes, and I still am. And a Judith Merrill curated collection called Beyond Human Ken that had some of these absolutely crazy short stories that I read and I read and I read till it's almost falling apart. It's in pieces now because I've had it so long. And it showed me the boundaries of what were not ordinary and what were not the stories I was hearing about in school. And it turned me into somebody that was not like the other kids. Gee, thanks, Dad.
Would you really want to be like the other kids?
Probably not. I mean, he was my dad and he made me weird, but, I loved him anyway. He was also a cosplayer, so, I was doomed from the start.
Lee, how about you? What's that first inspirational, the first one you really remember?
Well, keep in mind I was 19 or 20 at this point. Terminally naive. I'd come from a farming community. Never quite hit it in with the other kid, with the kids in high school. I hated high school. And the book was Stranger in a Strange Land. First, when I was my first access to science fiction. And after I finished going, they did what? I started looking at the concepts and found family, women with agency, women that weren't cookie cutter types. and a concept that maybe there's more to, quote, religion, end quote, than what we got fed at Sunday school until I got kicked out. Yes, I got kicked out of Sunday school. Don't ask. But it was a broadening of my universe at that point, which is why I he handed me, as I said, Glory Road and Moon is the Harsh Mistress, and it was, I was flat out in love. I loved the ideas that were being presented, and it was a lot more entertaining than Nancy Drew, I can tell you, for me at least. And I think that is probably explains a lot about me from just what got me started.
All right, Nancy, your turn.
It was The Time of the Great Freeze by Robert Silverberg. It was a YA that I got in the junior high school library. It's the first dystopian / post-apocalyptic fiction I remember reading. And I haven't read it in a long time, but many, many years ago, I saw it in a used book bin, and I bought a copy because I have a real fondness for that book because of that. And people, it was another ice age, and people lived kind of in silos under the ground, and they were going out to try to find food. And that's really all I remember about it at this point, except that I loved it. And that book led me into Clarke, who in turn led me into Asimov. I worked in high school there. I grew up in a college town, and I worked in the college bookstore in the summer, and they had camps, kids playing basketball, tennis, whatever. And when they weren't on break, it was dead quiet because this college didn't do summer school, and we had permission to read. And they had a science fiction section, and it was full of Arthur C. Clarke. So I got to sit there and read Arthur C. Clarke. And, being a comic book nerd, I can read a paperback so that you can't tell it's been read. So I was reading very carefully so it would not hurt the sale value of the book. And I loved it. And so I'd have to say reading adult science fiction started with Robert Silverberg.
One of the joyous things, right, for all the sci-fi we're talking about here, one of the first glorious things. I mean, we're going to talk about the characters in the story, but one of the first things that always grabs you is the tech, right? The ray guns, it's the spaceships, it's the subs that carry you to the depths. Personally, I'm still a little, miffed here. I don't have a flying car, but all of that being said, there's all this grand, glorious technology that we see, and and we've talked about in the past, how science fiction has influenced technology. Star Trek, the communicators and cell phones, and all the kind of fun, cool stuff. But when I think through all of the stuff that I read, I've seen on screen and whatnot, one of the devices that still sits with me to this day is the time machine, right? And it's going back to Wells. And a number of years ago, I found somebody had picked up a series where they kind of had continued what happened after the end of the first story, right? And it was about, he took a trip and winds up going into the far future and seeing how things, evolve and then back and forth. So, Doc, when you think about it, what is one of the technologies you've read about in all the good old classics, and how did it make, and what was something about it that made you kind of shift the way you looked at things?
A technology read about in the classics that changed my outlook on things.
Whether it was a toy you just, whether it was something you just really wanted to go play with, or is it something that really inspired you, or maybe something you just looked at and said, "Oh, I got to have that."
Now that's a difficult question. I've read so widely. There was never like one thing. From what I read, now I will admit I grew up watching Star Trek, and you've got spaceships and the communicators and stuff that you've already talked about. I was also growing up when Space 1999 was on TV, and I love the design of the Eagle spacecraft. I thought the comlink was a little bulky, but I love the guns that they had. But from reading, there were just so many different technologies and aspects on it. But the one thing that comes to mind was a story where I can't even remember the name of it, but basically they had phone booths, and you dialed up a location and you were there. They were teleport booths. So they had problems with flash mobs because and this was way before flash mobs in real life ever became a thing. That people would see stuff on the news or on television, and they just go to their booth and dial themselves there and be part of the spectacle. And so suddenly you'd have tons of people pouring out of these booths and creating whole new problems. That's the one thing that just comes to my memory. And I don't know that I can say that it's I guess I didn't really think about it. It has changed my outlook on things. Is that there's always unintended consequences of technology, and that's a good example of one.
Being somebody that's used to be on the road 48 weeks a year and has spent a lot of time in airports, I will take my phone booth that will bounce me somewhere in a heart.
Yep.
All right, Elektra, how about you? What? Oh, go ahead, Lee.
As long as it's wheelchair accessible, please.
As long as we're talking about unintended consequences of technology, I want to go back in time and be able to observe. It's part of the alternate history thing. It would make my research so much easier if I could go back there and actually see it instead of reading about it. But you've got to be careful, because as a sound of thunder, just one screw up and suddenly the world as we know it is not quite right.
Do you want to actually go back in time, or do you just want to be able to see into the past?
Come on, I want to be able to walk around and check things out.
You want to smell how bad it smells.
Oh, yeah.
This is why I'll never be allowed to go back in time. I would definitively be the one that the first time I opened the door to the time machine and tripped over something, I'm like going to land my time machine on somebody that is pivotal in the genetic lines for something. There's no question about that with me. I am the unintended consequence. How about you, Lee? What's your gadget?
My gadget is simple: the waterbed. I first saw the concept in Stranger in a Strange Land. I have been sleeping on one now for almost 40 years, and I'm spoiled. So that I got my gadget.
Yep. And I love the fact that the guy that invented the waterbed tried to patent it, and he couldn't get his patent because Heinlein had already described it very well.
Nancy, how about you?
Legion of Superheroes Time Bubble. I think it qualifies as a classic because Adventure 247, when the Legion went back in time to meet Superboy, was published in 1958. And so I think that would be a lot of fun, because I too would like to see what happened on certain occasions in history. But the thing that changed my outlook about technology that really was actually fairly prescient was Clark's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Open the pod bay doors, Hal. I can't do that, Dave. It's like, oh, holy blankety blank. So that really was food for thought about where are we going with technology. I don't know if the book qualifies as a classic. I saw the movie in the 1970s before I read the book, but Clark himself certainly should qualify as a classic science fiction author.
Oh, the book is.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'll allow it. I have the monolith in the background.
Well, you're the moderator. You have the power.
Wendy, how about you? What's that classic device?
Oh, I'm thinking back to the juveniles of Heinlein, and I loved how the characters had such an innate knowledge of the machinery and the science behind it and the travel in space. Most of his characters are like that. And I really love that they all use slide rules back then. Calculators had not been invented, so all of them had a slide rule. And I wanted one so bad, and I still have trouble finding them. And if you do, they're antiques, so they're very expensive. But I do remember a conversation with an elderly engineer who used to work for NASA, and he swore by his slide rule. And he says, I can get to my answer just as fast with those fancy calculators. You don't need one of those things. Yeah, I have my slide rule. but I loved the way that Heinlein would portray his characters, as sometimes they started from very humble beginnings, but through their own knowledge and agency were able to learn about the world around them and apply what they learned to better their situation and to go forward and eventually better the world. And I really would like to see more of that in our world today and with our young people, to be perfectly honest, to know that the world is in their hands and that they can do something with it, but they have to use their intelligence and they need to know how to learn, if that makes any sense. And Heinlein really showed that in his juveniles. All his young people had so much agency, whether male or female. Usually it was male because, of course, he was writing for a publisher who wanted young adult books for boys. So that's why his protagonists were usually male. But I really love that can-do kind of hands-on attitude. And I'd love to be out there working in those spaceships that Heinlein describes so beautifully in so many of his books. You just felt like you were there and that you could go somewhere. And it felt so real, even though it was science fiction.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Elektra.
I just want to point out that I'm sitting here surrounded by Heinlein right now. The Virginia edition went on sale over the July 4th weekend, and I purchased all of Heinlein's works, including his letters, which I proofread, which is one of the reasons I picked them up. And it's well worth picking up, particularly his correspondence, which is remarkable to read.
Do you know there is a new Heinlein book that came out this past year? They found it in his files. They did a light edit on it and they released it. It's called The Pursuit of the Pascanera. And it's a juvenile Heinlein. Yeah, based off The Number of the Beast, but it goes in a completely different direction. It was fun. Again,
published
dated
by Kasich.
Time it was written. Yes.
Yeah, I know the publisher.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I have a copy, yes.
Cool.
So Elektra, yeah, and so I mean, like, I've got my full unabridged version of Stranger in a Strange Land on the shelf behind me.
Mine's leather bound, and I'm the one who proofread it.
You don't have the leather bound yet. It's coming.
Mine's falling apart.
So ironically enough, when I discovered Heinlein, and I was fairly young, and again, I was probably reading something. I didn't start with the juveniles. I started with The Stranger in a Strange Land, the full unabridged version. That was the first Heinlein I ever picked up.
Yeah, that's a departure.
Yeah. And so the next Heinlein I picked up was Starship Troopers. If you want to go from two spectrums of story. And a number of years ago, I read, and so I read a book that was based partially on the Heinlein letters, partially partially a biography of Heinlein, and part of it was also one of his early short stories, talking about his early on attempt at a failed political career and how eventually you could see those themes, and he found, went to that idea of my impact can come through storytelling, not politics. And it layers the letters through the story, and you can see those themes as they build. And so if you think about
Talking about Requiem, right?
yes, I was trying to remember the title of
Okay, I've got a copy here, leather bound, and my original copy is signed by the guy who put it together, who unfortunately has since passed. He was a remarkable Heinlein fan and a writer in his own right, and he was encouraged to write science fiction by Heinlein. And he was local Baltimore.
Yep.
He used to come to Balticon.
The good old fashions of the classics.
Yep.
So kind of continuing on that idea, Elektra, when you think about the authors, because again, one of the things that is true today, but was very true back then, was looking at playing with the ideas of themes and logical or sometimes illogical conclusions. How wrong can things go if I have a booth and I can just pop to anywhere in an instant, right? If we look at so many of the authors, it wasn't just the stories they told, it was the morality tales, it was the themes they played out. So is there a particular story or author or somebody like that you're thinking, you think of, whether it's Heinlein or somebody else, kind of where you see those themes and the influence they've had, not only on science fiction, but actually on culture, society?
Influence on culture. Oh, that takes thought. Okay, you have now stumped me. I'm not sure who's had overall influence on culture. I pass.
I can jump in here because I had just immediately thought of an example from Heinlein. If you read a lot of his books, a lot of his themes involve the idea that truly intelligent people don't follow the crowd. They judge things for themselves and they make their own rules. And I grew up as part of Generation X, and that kind of defines us as a generation, because nobody listened to us, so we made our own rules.
And there weren't that many of us, so nobody cared.
Yeah.
All right, Lee, thoughts?
No. Okay, Marion Zimmer Bradley. 2 short novels. One of them is The Spell Sword. The other is The Forbidden Tower. I was handed those 2 by a rape counselor. We were looking for a way to have a common language on some work we were doing. And to me, that kind of defines where, when women are suppressed, well, not just women, when anybody is bound by a societal role, it's a very good example of, one, you can fight City Hall, and 2, how to go about it. And it may be the basis of what got me started as an activist at about the same time. And I've been a human rights activist now for a little over 50 years. But the concept of mutual support, ideas and energies being interwoven, it was that, to me, is probably a big one for something that is something to the point you were asking about. And the other one, just for the concept of kindness, is Zena Henderson stories, the people stories. Again, one person can make a difference and be changed in their own way. by the difference they're making. Which those when I need a good cry, they're the other ones I pick up. But that pretty much is it for me.
Nancy?
Well, I would like to cite Gordon R. Dickson's Child Cycle, when he looked at the three different philosophical approaches that people tend to take. You have the militaristic Dorsai, who have a planet that has no natural resources, and so they've become the best mercenaries in the galaxy. And then you have the humanists, who I think come to prominence in Chantry Guild, if I remember correctly. And then you have the others led by Blaze Aarons. And unfortunately, Gordon R. Dickson died before he completed that cycle. So I'm not sure where he was exactly going with it. But I also really loved the Darkover books. And a friend of mine gave me free Amazons of Darkover and one of the Tower books. I forget which one. And I read, this was a couple of years after the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced. And so the free Amazons really resonated with a lot of women I know. I don't know that it would be fair to say it changed the culture so much as it meshed with what was then a cultural movement almost. And, you know, aside from all that, Darkover is just a wonderful series anyway. I was very disappointed that Gordon R. Dickson never finished that series, in part because I read them in the wrong order. I thought Chantry Guild came before the final encyclopedia. And I would periodically say, well, he went off and wrote something else and left Hal Mayne stranded on the final encyclopedia waiting for a fight. And then I found out that Chantry Guild actually came after the final encyclopedia. But those books are well worth reading, even if his grand vision wasn't realized. They're just good adventure stories with a kind of a thoughtful edge to them.
Wendy?
Well, I am thrilled to find fellow Darkover fans here, because I've probably read every single Darkover book that there is, and I've been reading the sequels written by Deborah Ross as well, who took up Marion Zimmer Bradley's mantle. I guess she was the editor of the anthologies under Marion's wing, and then had her blessings to go forward. And I noticed there is somewhat of a difference between the two authors, but it's slight. And I really think Deborah has captured Darkover, which thrills me because I have new Darkover books, and I'm very happy to read those. But I love the world that Marion Zimmer Bradley developed between the telepaths in the tower, to the free Amazons, the Dry Towners, which eventually she explained as being a second immigrant group who came after the original colonists from the first one, and that the fact that they were on a planet around a red dwarf, which of course made it a very icy cold world. It was just barely habitable by humans, but they made it work. And it really brings to mind what is in the future for humanity as we do start exploring other planets, because, you know, our world is unique in some ways. There are other stars which are more frequently found close by that we may have to adapt to. And I think Darkover is a nice template of how maybe that might happen one day. Although I suspect we won't all go back to medieval times when that happens.
No.
But I think an author we haven't really touched on is Ursula Le Guin. And
before you hit Ursula,
Mm-hmm.
An important thing to hit on Darkover was the prohibition on distance weapons.
Oh,
if you're going to kill somebody, you have to kill them with something that you can touch them.
Do it up close and personal.
Yes.
You can't shoot them from a distance with an arrow or spear. You have to use a sword or a knife or your bare hands. The compact required that.
The compact was a sense of honor among the Darkovers. And then when the Terrans came to the world who used blasters and things, it was almost beyond their concept because of that. They were so disgusted by this kind of thing. But yeah, I agree. The compact is actually a very unique concept. I mean, Marion really packed a lot of interesting ideas that are applicable today as it was back when she wrote them. They're great books. I know they're not probably as prominent to the young readers today, just maybe because of their age, or they just maybe don't realize that she was an author of some prominence, 30, 40 years ago. But they're definitely, all of them are well worth reading. And if you need a suggestion about which book to start with, I usually recommend The Bloody Sun. That was the first one I read for Marion Zimmer Bradley, and it really sets up her world. It was her first book. Her writing does get better with later books, but yeah, it's just an incredible series with so many nuances. It's wonderful. But I guess we were talking about impact as well, and I just wanted to bring up Ursula Guin because, frankly, her work is just phenomenal. She was an archaeologist in training, and she applied a lot of the concepts that she learned through archaeology into her books. Her characters have agency. There's equality of the sexes. Sure, and some of her time travel ideas are they're really incredible. And I think if there's an author who has had an impact on us today, I would say it would be Le Guin. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
I was actually going to throw that out there if nobody else mentioned it, was Left Hand of Darkness, right?
Yes.
Because that is probably one of the ones that has influenced much more than I think most people know. A lot of the ideas of androgyny, and where we see a lot of that started, actually came out of that book. Yep. So let me throw this out there just a little bit different way then, and I'm gonna start with you on this one, Lee. We've seen a lot of these works taken and interpreted on film, whether it's TV, movies, even good old classic radio shows, right? We just had the Fairy Films book come out, and my piece in that was talking about the 84 version of Dune as an interpretation from Frank Herbert. And, on an entire side bet, my argument is a lot of it incorporates elements of fairy folklore and ancient fairy folklore in as part of the baseline, and it pulls in Frank Herbert's works and some of the research. But part of the reason for that argument is talking about the naturalist movement, the fact that so much of it was environmentally driven and whatnot. And so now we've seen a lot of different film interpretations of Dune. The latest one we've got, part 2 is about to come out here as well. So Lee, if we look at a lot of the classic books, classic works, is there one where you're looking at it and we look at the book and the movie, and that any of the interpretations, so is there one that you really love or one that you really hate? What's one that you look at and you're like,
Starship Troopers. The book is a love letter to the military, and all of the things that he was a Navy man, so it is not, what is the phrase it is not militaristic. It's a love letter to the military, and it's talking about civil responsibility. Maybe not in the way that we use it now, but the concept is there. And the movie, while wasn't all that bad, Michael Ironside could read the phone book and I'd be happy. But they missed the point. In the movie, they missed the bloody point.
That was the director.
Yeah.
I think the script people had something to do with it. That's the one that I am least fond of, even though I enjoy the movie. The book is better. There are parts of both Dunes that I've seen. One, the version in the 80s, and I actually did see the first part of the current one. and if I could mix and match, I'd be a happy camper. But they didn't do too badly. At least in the second movie, they're taking more parts to do it. The first one, it's a good thing I read the book, because the movie made no sense at all, even though I like some of the way they handle things. I don't have any that I absolutely want to throw against the wall, if that makes any sense.
All right, Nancy, how about you?
Well, I'm tempted to say 2001: A Space Odyssey, but I remember being very confused by the end of the movie and slightly confused at the end of the book. So that's kind of a draw between the book and the movie for me. I liked the first Dune. Okay. I didn't love it. I haven't watched the recent one because, no offense to the lead actor, I'm not a fan. And so I just am giving that one a pass. So I don't think I have a lot to offer on this one.
Wendy?
Well, there's so many science fiction books that have been adapted. I'm thinking of A Princess of Mars, which was turned into the John Carter movie, put out by Andrew Stanton a few years ago. And I actually thought it was a fair interpretation of the book. I know the movie is notorious as a quote unquote failure, but if you actually watch it, it's actually a lot of fun. And I really feel it captured the spirit of the original book, A Princess of Mars, and brought it to a modern audience. A few concepts maybe were pulled from other sources, and there was a lot of comments about the film being derivative of things like Star Wars and other things. But what these people failed to realize is that ERB came first. All these other movies that pulled from A Princess of Mars and came out earlier than the Princess of Mars film were stealing from that source material, in a sense. What is it they say? George Lucas stole very well from everybody, from the Lensman to whatever, to create Star Wars. And ERB was no exception. So, but I like the interpretation of the John Carter movie. I really wish the sequel had been made, as was promised to the fans, but unfortunately did not come to be. And yeah, and I'll speak to the Dune. I saw the 1984 version. I was able to follow along, but I'm a fan of Frank Herbert. I've read Dune several times, and I really love the first four books of the series, from Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Doom, and The God Emperor Dune. I think those are classics that everyone should read at some point in their life, kind of like how everyone should read Moby Dick, if you know what I mean. But sorry, Jim. But yeah, it's I like the current adaptation of Dune. I'm very much looking forward to part 2, and from what I understand, part 3 just got greenlit, and I believe that'll be Dune Messiah, which often is not adapted to film. So I'm very curious to see what this director does. He seems to really love the source material, and he seems to be very true to the basic premises of the book. As you know, when you make a film, the language of film is a bit different than the language in a book. In books, we as authors use our words to explain scenes. But in filmmaking, there's a lot of just visual language that goes on. And sometimes when you adapt a book into that visual language, things need to be slightly changed. But I really think that Denis Villeneuve has really found that balance, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what else he can do. He may be the Steven Spielberg of our time.
Doc?
Okay. I'm going to throw out several examples, and it's going to dance around a little bit, but kind of a deep cut. Fantastic Voyage, which may actually have come out before I was actually born, but I thought I thought it was a really good representation of Asimov's story about miniaturizing people and putting them into a patient in order to save his life. Let's see. You mentioned 2001, but the one I think about is 2010. I thought that 2010 was much closer to the book. They obviously cut some stuff for time, but I found it a really good adaptation of the story. Let's see, and there was I had a third one. I guess I'll talk about the Dune. I've seen both the 84 Dune and the first part of this one. I really feel like the current version of Dune is more in line with the original books. I had read Herbert before I saw the previous one, so I knew what was going on, but I was a little bit miffed at some of the things that they cut and they changed. And the current version seems to be trying to be much more accurate to the books. Oh, and the other one I want to throw out here, but I guess I can't really because I haven't read the books, is The Expanse. But from what I understand, it was an amazing TV show, and from what I understand, it was really close to the books.
How about you, Elektra?
I'm a movie critic, or I used to be. I used to write reviews. I will be brief. Agreement with Doc on Fantastic Voyage. It's a great adaptation. It holds up pretty well. I'm going to disagree with a whole bunch of people about Dune. 1984 does not live up to its prologue, which was fantastic, and then it fails right after that. The part one of the current one is pretty good. I'm waiting for part two because it's still half a movie. The Sci-Fi miniseries, which no one has mentioned, is actually pretty damn good, starring Alec Newman. Look it up. It's great. Sci-Fi also did a great adaptation of Childhood's End, maybe 7-8 years ago. And please, I'm waiting for an adaptation of Zelazny's Amber. Could somebody please do that?
That would be beautiful.
And there's some others.
You're here, Elektra.
Actually,
I could go on all night, but I'm going to stop it there.
Yeah, we're just. I mean, like I say, we can't even begin to cover just all the classics. I mean, for example, just because we're all writers. Fahrenheit 451. We haven't gotten into Bradbury or anybody like that. The Foundation series that's currently on. I've seen a little bit of that. That series. We continue to see adaptations of these classics and these stories brought forward and reimagined. If we go back to Fahrenheit 451, the original version that was done of that. If we look at a lot of these adaptations that have been done, it's how well do they stick to the source material, but often how well do they actually stick to the theme, right? How well do they go to the theme versus how often do things get lost? I mean, we can look at, the original Planet of the Apes and then the morass that came after that. We can look at their fun films, not that true to the original source material in a lot of ways. But I mean, when we look at really all those things of classic sci-fi, right, and how we define classic, I think is also a bit open to interpretation, right? But I mean, when we look at really the classic writers, the classic authors, the people that have steered where we're going, when we think about all this, Nancy, who's the author, whose work is it that really has, I guess, most touched you and impacted you overall? And how has it made its way into some of your work?
Well, that changes from year to year, is which one's more on my mind. I used to teach a class, college class on science fiction, fantasy, and society. And the books that resonated most with the students were The Caves of Steel by Asimov, because they saw a lot of parallels between the treatment of Daniil and the other androids and the current treatment of immigrants. in Fahrenheit 451, with the absorption of Montag's wife in the big screen and the tech, they saw that as coming on through. And then the part about people memorizing parts of books really meant a lot to them. And I think there was one other one, but I've lost it. It's not so much that it influences my work. I can't really point to anything that I've drawn on those for, but I hope I've picked up something about how to tell a good story and how to make a point without using the story as a bludgeon, because Asimov and Bradbury both did. And I'm sure as soon as you go around, I'll remember what the third one was, but it's not vital to anyone's life that I remember that. So I'll just go with those two for now.
Wendy?
Boy, a favorite author that influenced me. It's not really a science fiction author. I think that would have to be Jane Austen. She kind of invented the romance genre. She wrote about her contemporary times, but now we look at them as historical in a sense of the Regency period, just because so many years have passed. She really captured the way women lived and thought, and elevated them in a way that was never really done before, because most authors at the time were men. And I really respect her as an author. My first book, The Curate's Brother, is actually a fanfic based off of her book Persuasion. And I really can only hope to bring the wit and the agency and intelligence in her writing to my own. But that's always the dream, right?
Doc?
So when you ask me what sci-fi author has had the biggest impact on my writing, then I have to say Sharon Lee and Steve Miller, because I love the way that they managed to present multiple societies in the lead-in series just by immersing you into it. And I've tried to do the same sort of thing in my adventure stories. Is like, I don't info dump, I don't backfill. I throw you into the action and I let little pieces leak out around the edges. But if you want to focus on the more classic authors, the ones who wrote a while earlier and are mostly dead, I would have to point to Heinlein's Glory Road. That was very much a touchstone book for me for a long time. I think it's part of the reason why I love writing adventure. And about part of it is about being a hero and just trying to be your own person and dealing with adversity as it comes. And that's part of what I get out of that. And I'm very fond of the idea of heroes being people who are not inherently special, but who manage to rise to the occasion when difficulty happens.
Elektra?
Well, Zelazny's A Night in the Lonesome October, which we reread every October. One night, each night of October, obviously, a habit we share with Steve Miller and Sharon Lee. And also The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. I try to, always know where my towel is. It's an important thing to keep you safe and comfortable. Let's just leave it at that.
I just have a big red button. That's just...
Don't panic.
Lee, how about you?
Well, from the standpoint of impact, I'd have to say Marion Zimmer Bradley because, well, she got me started in this business. I made my first 5 or 6 sales to her for the anthologies, the Sword and Sorceress, the Last Darkover anthology, in the magazine. So yeah, she kind of got me started. In terms of role model, I suppose you'd say, I have to come a little closer to our current time period and say Elizabeth Moon. I have learned a lot from that lady. And she got me started writing space opera, of all things, which I thoroughly delighted doing, particularly since it involves a spacefaring cat house. But those have been my 2 biggest influences, I'd say.
Well, you know, for me, the stuff that got me started was going to kind of be my big 3 of Asimov, Heinlein, and of course, Arthur C. Clarke. You know, the big ones for me were always, I go back to Stranger in a Strange Land. That was what drove me to write the first couple of pieces of sci-fi. Even though I was in high school when I did it, it was some of the characters and ideas that pushed me to kind of go to that first sci-fi, was going back and rereading that. So, well, while we could sit here and go and do this all night long, I think we're going to have to wrap up this at least as a part 1. But before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. So, Wendy, website, social media, and the latest book, if you want to let people know where to find it.
Will do, Jim. I'm Wendy Van Camp. I am the Poet Laureate for the city of Anaheim, California. I am a speculative poet. I'm an author, an illustrator, and I'm the editor of science fiction poetry anthologies. You can find me at my website, which is wendyvancamp.com, and you can subscribe to my monthly newsletter, which is nowastedink.substack.com. The newsletter comes with a voiceover done by yours truly. So if you haven't tired of my voice yet, you're on this podcast, you can listen to me actually read the newsletter. And I include a writing tips essay. I do a little ramble about my life and things that I've done in the past. And I include a poem of the month. So I hope to see you there.
Doc?
All right. I am Doc Coleman. I write steampunk comedy adventure. If you're interested in learning more about me or my works, go to your favorite search engine and search for Doc Coleman Steampunk. This will take you to my website at doccoleman.com. It'll also help you find my Amazon author page where you can see all of my published works. And you can look at samples and decide if they're right for you or someone that you love. And my latest book is actually an anthology that's been published by Eastbeck Books. It's called A Cast of Crows. It's the first book in the Forgotten Lore series, and we're actually getting warmed up to kick off the Kickstarter for the second one. So hopefully that will be out, and that'll by the time this episode airs, and that'll be A Bay of Hounds.
Elektra?
Elektra Hammond. You can find out everything you want to know about me at untilmidnight.com. On Mastodon, I'm at Elektra at wandering.shop. And look for a new story from me in Permutations, a Well-World anthology coming out from Kasich Press in the near future.
Lee?
Lee Martindale. I'm a short story writer, anthology editor. You can find me and information about my work at herphaven.net, which has bibliography, blog link, e-store link, and other information. My latest book is Bard's Road, the collected fiction of Lee Martindale. available at Amazon, BNN in ebook form, also signed from me at harphaven.net, Harphaven Merchanter, also linked from the main webpage.
Nancy?
You can find me at nancynorthcott.com. On social media, I am still on Twitter, and that's where I'm probably most active on social media. I do have a Facebook author page, but I'm hardly ever there. And I have an Instagram page I'm learning to use, and a Pinterest page that gets updated every now and again. My latest book is The King's Champion. It's the third volume in my Boar King's Honor historical fantasy trilogy. It's set during the summer of 1940, opens with the Dunkirk evacuation, closes as the Blitz is beginning, and has wizards trying to deal with Operation Sea Lion. The Speaker for All, my next Outcastation book, will be out before the end of the year.
And I've been your host, Jim Nettles. And you can find me at jamesbnettles.com, authorcensusworkshops.com, thespeculative-fiction-academy.com, creatingprose.com, and of course, here at Continual. And we'll see everybody again soon.